Eric and Sarah tonight and be able to eat with them along with Jack, and appreciate that. But other than that, I'm going to kind of cut down my remarks, and there's a reason why. I actually had two lessons that I looked at, and I decided I would combine them. And so this will be a lesson that we will go kind of like put it in gear and go into the end and try to get everything in. And if I can't, then I'll cut it off as appropriate. You know, there are two kinds of people really in the world when you think about it. There are people who believe in God, and therefore they look for answers from that faith. And then there are people who don't. And generally speaking, the term that has been used most often is secular humanist, meaning that there are people who believe that man is the epitome of all things, that there is nothing greater than man. And that's kind of where we are in our society. When we look at the subject of creation, and we're talking about creation this evening, when you think of creation, a study of creation is really not, technically speaking, a scientific study. It is a study of philosophy, simply because it is something that we cannot observe, could not, because no one was present, and simply because it is not something that can be reproduced in some type of an experimental laboratory situation. And so consequently, really, if you were in a court of law, I suppose that you would call it circumstantial evidence, and that's what you have. And you're looking at that circumstantial evidence, and you're trying to make a decision as to whether all things exist because of God or whether they don't. Now, that being true, I had a lesson not too long ago, and it was entitled, "If Not God, What is the Answer?" And it is basically a creation lesson. I want you to think about some things and consider them with me. Genesis 1 and verse 1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." I'm still an old school person, use the King James translation. Some of you may be reading others, but they are very similar. Here's the question I have to ask. If not God, what is the answer? What power created the material of which the universe is comprised, if not God? Now, you know, it's one thing to say that God was not responsible because there is no God. But if you're going to say that, then you have to be able to have something to take his place. So what is it? What is it that takes the place of God? If it's not God who created all the material of which the universe is made, then who did? And that is a question that has to be answered. Second question, if not God, what is the answer to this question? What intelligence brought order out of chaos? Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2 says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness upon the face of the deep." Obviously, he's saying there was no system to things as they were originally created. So the question comes, what intelligence brought order out of chaos? Because we have to understand that if we look at order coming to a chaotic situation, the only way that's ever accomplished is by some form of intelligence. So if it's not God, what is that form of intelligence? And we need to really consider that and think of what answer we might give. And then the third question would be this. If not God, what is the answer? How did everything needed for life to exist come into existence? Think of what's needed. You have light. Well, if you look at Genesis chapter 1, beginning there in verse 3, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And then you stop and you think about there has to be water. Well, then what do you see? Well, he goes on to say, as he considers there, going down, in verse 7, God made the firmament, divided the waters which are under the firmament from the waters which are above the firmament. God called the firmament heaven, the evening and the morning were the second day, and God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." That includes the third thing, and that is a land environment. So you have, in fact, light, which is absolutely essential to life, and everyone understands that. And you have water, which is absolutely essential to life. Everyone understands that. And you have the soil, And everyone understands the essentiality of that. And then, of course, the only thing that you can't see that's essential is atmosphere. And if you stop and you think of the atmosphere, how ingenious that was, you begin to think of that intelligence thing. All plants emit what? Carbon dioxide. All animals emit what? Carbon dioxide. All plants emit what? Oxygen. What do plants use for their growth process? Carbon dioxide. What do animals use for their growth process? Oxygen. You just begin to think of that, and you have to stop and consider and ask yourself the question, if not God, what is the answer? How did everything needed come into existence? Where did it come from if God is not responsible? And then you begin to read beginning in verse 11, and we won't read all the verses, but it goes through verse 25. You know, you have all the life forms. And what was the first thing that was created? Now, one thing that you'll find if you begin to look at those who believe in creation from a godly perspective and those who believe in creation from the standpoint of an accidental occurrence and then an evolutionary process leading to the life as we know it, all of us pretty much agree on this. Plants were the first thing to come along. That's exactly what God said. He said, let the earth bring forth grass, and the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding seed after his kind, which is also an interesting thing because we understand that there are certain limits when you begin to crossbreed things to what you can and you can't do. If you continue reading there, he begins there in verse 20, and he begins to talk about the animal creatures. And where did the first ones arrive? Whether you're looking at the scriptures or whether you're looking at an evolutionary chart, the first life, we're told, began where? Under the water. And that's exactly what he said. God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly moving creatures that have life and fowl that may fly above the earth. What's the second thing? The fowl. And that we're all in agreement on. But the question is not, are we in agreement as to the order? The question is, we're talking about Genesis here. We're talking about the book of beginnings. How did those things begin? If it were not God who established those forms of life, then what is the answer? How did that come to pass? And why did it come to pass in that way? And then you begin to think about this. And this may be the most troubling thing of all. How is it that human beings, when you say if not God, what is the answer? How is it that human beings are so different from the rest of the animal kingdom? Now, I acknowledge the fact that human beings have a body that is an animal body, no question. We have a heart, we have lungs, and we have liver, and we have all the various things that other animal life forms have. But when you ask the question, how is it that human beings are so different? Anybody knows that human beings are different. I mean, it doesn't take very much to know that because, in fact, our laws. How many animals are killed in the United States every day to provide for the food sources of the people of this country? I don't know. I don't know the number, but I'm pretty sure that it would be in the millions. Pretty certain. We have 350 million people. I'm pretty certain that millions of animals are slaughtered every day. How many human beings are slaughtered every day? If we take out the subject of abortion, which is an anomaly that's not part of our lesson tonight. But even when you begin to think about abortion, people who believe in abortion still will prosecute a person who is a drunk driver and hits a woman with child, even if it's at the very beginning of conception, for 2 murders. So they still know the truth, even though they don't acknowledge it in those arguments. But human beings are different. We all know that. Why? If not God, what is the answer? Why is it we view them differently? It couldn't possibly be that Genesis 1 says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God created him, male and female created them. Now let's think about this. If not God, what is the answer? Who established the laws of nature? Now, Genesis 1 doesn't really do a lot of discussion of the laws of nature. But there is a passage that talks a great deal about the laws of nature. And it also was really concerning the creation, though it is not in Genesis 1. The passage of which I speak is in the book of Job, chapter 38. And in Job chapter 38, when you read what he says in verse 4, he's really kind of putting that question out to you. If not God, what is the answer? When he says, who established the laws of nature? He said, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth. In other words, where were you? Go back to that original statement we made, that the study of beginnings is really a philosophical question. It's a matter of faith. It's not a matter of scientific discovery, because it's really a little beyond us. But if you go to this passage, God asked Job the question that is pertinent. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? That's what he asked. And basically what he's saying is, we human beings are not qualified to speak on the subject of creation in a dogmatic way from what we've observed and what we can learn from scientific things. What we are in a position of doing is what we believe to be true is where we are. It is a philosophical question. It's a matter of faith. We believe that God is, though we have not seen him. And you think about this idea. I'm going to read you a few verses here. It's interesting. In Job 38, verse 12, hast thou commanded the morning since thy days, and caused the day spring to know his place? And you begin to think of what he's talking about. He's talking about, if you look at the planets and what dictates day and night, and what dictates the years that we are in and the various months of the year that we have, how did they come to be? How did they? If not God, what is the answer? If you look at verse 14, he says, talking about the earth, it is turned as clay to the seal, and they stand as a garment. In other words, what he's saying is, the earth revolves, and it does. And the idea is that this is something that happens. When you look at the earth, it is a strange thing. You ever been to a place and you've seen a magician, and he supposedly levitates someone, and to make his point, he runs his hand under it, he runs his hand over it? That's exactly what you look at when you look at space. You can run your hand under the earth, you can run your hand over the earth. What power holds it? If not God, what is the answer? And then you begin to look down to verse 19, and he says, where is the way where light dwelleth? You look at a rainbow, and sometimes you don't realize what you're looking at. You ever take a prism and do the same thing on a wall? You know what it does? It divides the light. It divides it into different forms. And so light, when you see light, you don't realize that it has everything from reds on down the scale, the blues, and all that's in between. And that makes up light. But it can be divided. And that's what you have when you see a rainbow. Those colors are actually light divided. And he's asking that question. He says, where's the way where light dwelleth? Now, we kind of know that answer now. But who put that in place? If not God, what is the answer? In verse 22, and I may stop with that when there are others here, hast thou entered the treasures of the snow, or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail? You know, snow is a spectacular thing to consider if you ever look at it and study it from a scientific viewpoint. You think man can reproduce that? Not really. I mean, you're looking at something that you're going to have to ask yourself the question when you look at these laws of nature. If not God, what is the answer? It's not enough just to say, there's no God. Okay, if you're going to say there's no God, okay. Looking at all these things, all of a sudden you have to make a decision. Why? How did that occur? So we've thrown out God out. So we've got to put something in his place. What are we going to put there? Now let's think about this. If we reject God as the answer to these questions, what are you left with? You ever thought about that? What are you left with? Just look and consider. What you're left with would be accidental occurrences. That's what you're left with. That's why when you look at men like Stephen Hawking, who's now deceased, but when he was speaking, he was talking about, and he was given great praise for his talking about the black hole and the explosion that led to our universe and all those things. And people just oohed and awed at that. But let me ask you a question. If you read a simple passage, Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 4, you know what it says? It said, every house is builded by some man, but he that made all things is God. Now let's think about it a moment. If you were to use this as a truism, a statement that would be true, would it be so that if you said something is, therefore something was? Isn't that true? Don't you believe that? Do you believe that you ride down the street today and there's no house, and tomorrow somehow one just appeared? You don't believe that. You believe where something is, something was. So then you're in this position of saying, was it an accidental occurrence or is it God? And then the next question you think about is that order only comes about by intelligence. It doesn't come about accidentally. Just stop and think for a moment. If you ever look at, I'm told, and I don't know if it's true or not, that the strongest natural phenomena that exists, as far as just instantly, is a tornado. I'm told that that's true by those who know. I am told that the strongest natural phenomena in sense of the most damage is a hurricane. Now, if you look at the after effects of a hurricane, you look at the after effects of a tornado, do you ever see any sign of order? Do you look at that and you see there's a sign of order there? There's something that happened, and all of a sudden something great came out of it. In other words, if you had a lumber yard and a tornado hit the lumber yard, does a house appear? And you know it doesn't. It takes intelligence to cause that to appear. So that puts you in a position to where what you know to be true leads you to say, if it's not God, there has to be something else. So I have to be searching for that. I can't just say there's nothing, that it's just an accidental occurrence, because we know accidental occurrences don't lead to those things. Those things, in fact, are planned. Now, let's just ask yourself a question. Would you accept that answer in any other circumstance? Let me ask you a question. Suppose that you came to my house and I bought a brand new car. And you came to the house and you said, where'd you get the car? I don't know, just appeared in the parking lot. And you say, who made the car? Well, nobody did. Actually, they tell me that we had a bad storm and they're in the metal yard and there's what we got left. You wouldn't believe that. And you say, well, it's not that far-fetched. But you know what's really interesting? That actually happened to a certain degree at one time. Benjamin Franklin was talking to a famous French atheist, and they were having a discussion about it. And Benjamin Franklin invited him to his apartment. They could discuss the matter further, whether God existed or not. The atheist entered the room, and Benjamin Franklin had built a model of the universe with the sun and the various planets, and had wires, and he had them revolving. And the man said, boy, that's marvelous. Who built it? And he said, nobody. It just happened. The man said, that can't happen. And Benjamin Franklin said, but you told me you believe the universe came about accidentally. And you're telling me this simple model can't come about accidentally? So we stop and we think about, if not God, what is the answer? Romans 1, I think, says a lot of things, but we're going to look at one of those things. You know, he says something in verse 28 that really is kind of a telltale sign. Have any of you ever made the statement to someone about any number of different things? You believe that because you want to. You probably have said that before. You probably have had that said to you. Well, here's what Paul said to the Romans. He said, even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. Well, I'm not really interested in the last part of that statement in this lesson. I'm interested in the first part of that statement. That is to say, they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. You know, sometimes our life is dictated by a lot of things, and what our belief system is dictated by a lot of things. I'm not naive enough to believe that growing up in a home where I was taken to church just about all the time had a tremendous impact on my life. I know that. I understand that. But you know, it came a point in my life when I had to look at those things and say, now, do I really believe those or not? Do I believe that to be true or do I not? I've done a lot of research in my life. And the more I look, the more I can't get past the fact that there has to be something greater than me, than human beings. There has to be. And I'm not going to be a person that says, I don't like to retain God in my knowledge. I want to acknowledge that I am subject to a higher power than myself, and that doesn't bother me, but it does bother some people. And so therefore, if not God, what's the answer? Well, sometimes we don't look at God because of the fact that we simply don't want him to exist. Well, there could be a lot of reasons for that. We won't go into those because we won't have the time. But now let's begin to go back to Genesis 1 and look at the second lesson that I had prepared. And that concludes the first one, at least an abbreviated form of it. And let's think about this. You know, I said that this lesson, well, I entitled this lesson, Another Look at Genesis, looking at it with a little different perspective. And I'll tell you in the beginning what my major point is when I get to the end. And that is to talk about man as a spiritual creature. That's the main thing I'm trying to impress upon you. So let's think about it. If we go back to Genesis chapter 1, we look at the creation, which we did a moment ago, and you had the earth bringing forth the grass, and the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding seed, and all those things were put into place. In the evening, the morning of the third day, the earth brought forth vegetation, without question. Second thing we looked at down in verse 20 was the waters brought forth aquatic creatures, those that lived in water. And then in verse 22, beginning through verse 25, he talks about various types of animals come into existence that live on the earth. Now, just keep that in mind. You have in the animal kingdom, you have some that live in water. You have some that live on the earth. Now, let's think about it. When God was going to create man, what did he do? God said in verse 26, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And notice what he then said. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. Let me ask you a question. What is it that gives man the ability to have dominion over the entire earth? What is it that gives him that ability? Is it his strength? You ever mess with a cow, a buffalo, a whale, a shark? It's not a strength. Is it just abilities to survive? You know, when a lot of animals have their young, they just leave them. And their young survive, and they do fine. A human being is born, and how long is it before a human being can live on their own? How long do you think? How many years? I don't really know, but it's quite a few. So what is it that makes man capable of having the ability to have dominion over all the animal kingdom? Go down to SeaWorld and look at the killer whales and the sharks and the dolphins and all those things. Just consider it and think about the fact they're doing everything that trainer wants them to do. What do you think the difference is? There's only one difference. Only one difference. You know, man has an ability that animals don't have. We have grandchildren. We have 9 of them, but the youngest ones are going to turn 3 in November. Those 3-year-olds, both of them, can get your cell phone, can find the games they want to play, and play them pretty well, perfectly. They're 3 years old. I've had some old dogs that lived to be 19 and 20 years old, but none of them could do that. Not one of them. What's the difference? What is the difference? You know, the only difference is the intellect of man. You think it has anything to do with what God said, let us make man in our own image? And think about the intellect of God who created the universe? And think about he's going to make us a little lower than the angels? And that we're going to have dominion over all the fish of the sea, etc.? In my mind, when I look at that and I say, okay, I see the vegetation, I see the water creatures, I see the land creatures, but I see that man is quite different than all of them. And if you're dealing from the standpoint of evolution, the question would come, why? How did he make that giant leap? And you'd have a pretty hard time dealing with it. But if you look at the standpoint of creation, God made man in his image. And that's what makes man different. Now let's think about this. But here's the problem. if God's going to make man in his image, there's obviously a great deal more involved than intellect, because God's an eternal creature, eternal being, excuse me. And when man was created, man's something different. In chapter 2 and verse 7 of the book of Genesis, talks about man coming into existence, and it says, "And the Lord God formed man out of the dust of the ground." What's that talking about? His body. "And then he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." You know, God made man in his image, but God gave man a temporary dwelling place to live in here on the earth. Because, see, God's a spirit, not flesh and blood. And man was created in his image as a spirit. But the fact of the matter is, spirits, how many spirits you ever saw? I haven't seen any. I've never seen any in my entire life. I've seen a lot of folks, a lot of human beings in fleshly bodies. We live in a temporary dwelling place, is what we do. God created us in his image, and then he created us a physical body that we can live here temporarily because we have to have it for the circumstances in which you're in. You say that's a little far-fetched. You really think so? In Ecclesiastes chapter 12, the inspired writer made this statement. He's talking about death. He talks about old age first. It's not a very pretty picture, and I can tell you, I'm almost 75. It's not. Heard two fellows in the nursing home one day talking, and one of them told the other, said, "You know, there's not much golden about the golden years." I thought, yeah, I began to realize that more and more. Except for grandchildren, a lot of wonderful things. But anyway, but you look at verse 7, and here's what he said. When you die, what happens? "Then shall the dust return unto the earth as it was." In other words, the temporary body that you're living in is going to be dissolved. It's not here anymore. "And the spirit," remember, you're made in the image of God, a spiritual creature. "And the spirit shall return unto God who gave it." Now let's look at another passage very similar to it. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 1. He says pretty much the same thing in different language. Paul said this, "We know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved." Let me ask you a question. How perfect a word do you think that is, if our earthly tabernacle be dissolved? Some years ago, Pat and I were with some friends, and we were out at a cemetery in Valdosta, Georgia. And because of the water table there back many years ago, they didn't bury a lot of people. Most folks were put into something on top of the ground. It wasn't too fancy sometimes, but these were Civil War people that died in the Civil War. And so they were mostly brick structures. And a lot of them had, old brick wasn't fired. It wasn't fired, and so it was just actually mud and water, and so eventually the rain dissolved it. And some of these places were just about completely gone. If you think about this word dissolved, if you looked in there, and I did, I couldn't resist the temptation. You know what's left? Basically nothing. You stop and you think of that word. If you've ever been around a human body that deteriorates, I can tell you right quick, after a period of time, it's probably the worst smell that I've ever smelled. Dead bodies are not pretty things. And eventually, they just go away. Does the person go away? That's the question. Remember, God made us, created us in his image. He gave us a temporary body to live in. It goes away. But you know what he then said? We have a building of God, and a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So you stop and think about that. Unlike all other living creatures, our body is not our being. Your dog, his body is his being. That's all the being he's got. And when he dies, used to be an old saying, you like Rover, you're dead all over. When he dies, he's gone. What about people? Do you believe that when someone dies, they're just gone? If you believe that God created man in his image, you don't believe that. So let me ask you something. Let me just put some things to you. I'm trying to make this a kind of a logical thing Let's ask this question. If you take an aquatic creature out of water, what will happen? Get your fish out of the fish bowl and lay them on the counter. How long does it survive? Not very long. Okay, we take our land creature. One of the most biggest confrontations I ever had, I came into the barn one day and I had a first cousin who's a little bit whacked out. He's drowning kittens in a bucket. He just drowned. He's getting one, drown it, and drowning another. Holding them under, they just died. So you put a land animal in water and see what happens. You call it drowning. So let's stop and let's think now for a moment. You know, if you separate a spiritual creature from God, life having any meaning, what does it have? Let's think about something. If you go to Genesis 3, which is also in the book of beginnings, it's talking about the beginning of sin and the effect it had on man. You begin reading in verse 17. And Adam is explaining the situation, or rather God is to Adam. And God says unto Adam, he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, hast eaten of the tree of which I have commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. So you can thank Adam and Eve for it. That's why you had a hard day's work today. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, talking about your physical body, and dust thou shalt return. And Adam called his wife's name Eve, because she was the mother of the living. Unto Adam also and his wife did the Lord God make coats of skins and clothe them. And the Lord God said, behold, the man is become as one of us, talking to other beings in heaven, to know good and evil now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword, which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. You know what it really said? It said we're in a bad state without God because we're spiritual creatures. Now, if you look at the world today, you see what I'm telling you. When you think about it, and you think about crimes that are committed, you do realize that crimes that are committed are also sinful. I mean, you don't really stop to realize it, but the fellow that murdered the lady, and it seems to have, he's accused of it. We'll use the words as the news media does, that he is at least a suspect. And if he did kill her, that not only is a crime, that is a sin, because it's a violation of the will of God. Thou shalt not kill. Now, he separated himself from God. That's what he'd done. What kind of position are we in when there's, you know, like a fish out of water? Like a human, like an animal placed in water? All of a sudden, we remove ourselves and we remove the spiritual aspect of our life. What does that do to us? Would you like to live in a community where people had no recognition of spiritual values? In other words, you live with the law of the jungle, the strongest person survives, and people had the most power, could just crush you. Would you like to live there? The only reason you don't, people don't sometimes realize all Western civilizations, the laws of the Western civilizations are all based on 10 Commandments. Where'd they come from? God spake them audibly to the people of Israel in Exodus chapter 20. But I want to read one last passage, and I want you to think about this. You know, when you're thinking about this idea of you're a spiritual creature, if you believe in God and you believe that God has created all things, then you believe that he created you in his image, then you are a spiritual creature. And you have great need of spiritual involvement to maintain yourself as a spiritual creature, just like you have need of the atmosphere and food. You have atmosphere of that spiritual life, that spiritual nourishment that comes from God. I want to read a passage in the book of Psalms, chapter 73. Or Psalm 73, either way you want to put that. But beginning in verse 20, read through verse 28. Here's what he said. So foolish was I and ignorant. Now, you know how you know what he talked of when he said that? So foolish was I and ignorant. I was as a beast before thee. You know what that means? Just think about what that means. That means I was like the rest of the animal creation that was not created in your image. That's what he meant. So foolish was I and ignorant. Nevertheless, I am continually with thee. Thou hast holding my right hand. Thou shalt guide me with thy counsel, and afterward receive me to glory. Whom have I in heaven but thee? And there's none upon the earth that I desire beside thee. My flesh and my heart faileth, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. For lo, they that are far from thee shall perish. Thou hast destroyed all them that go whoring from thee, but it is good for me to draw near to God. I have put my trust in the Lord God, that I may declare all thy works. You know, if you're going to talk about creation, the real value of talking about creation is not learning all the various groups of animals and all the various groups of plants and looking at all those things. The real value of looking at the Genesis account of creation is that you're not just that. You're more than that. But you know, I've often heard people talk about the fact that with great blessing comes great responsibility. So if we are a spiritual creature, where does that put us? You know, when I was a boy, I had an uncle that I was named after. My middle name is Eddis, a strange name, but my uncle was Eddis from Anderson, Alabama, Eddis Romaine. Had another uncle, his name was Wallace, his brother. They were very different in one aspect. Everybody then used mules. That was the way you worked your crops. You used mules. My Uncle Eddis was a person who believed that, well, Proverbs 10:12 says, you know, how you treat your animals has a lot to do with how you treat people. My Uncle Eddis was very kind to his animals. Now, they worked hard, and I don't mean he wouldn't discipline them when they got out of order, but he was very kind to them. But he rode by one day, and my Uncle Wallace had his mule, and he was mad at him. And he'd tied him to a tree, and he'd taken the trace chains off, and older people here know what a trace chain is. It's actually a link of chain. And he was beating him with it. And my Uncle Eddis went out there and grabbed him and stopped him and said, don't let me ever catch you doing that again. Do you think that's what God wants us to be? To just lord it over all these animals and just treat them any way we please? No. Does it mean we use them for food? Yeah. But if we just mean, you look at human beings and you consider that human beings have kind of a natural compassion. Where's that come from? Let me tell you another story. I was on the mail route one day in Pulaski when I was carrying the mail. And there were some folks who had pit bulldogs, and these were all fighting dogs who were still fighting. I mean, they were, I don't know all the details of that because that's illegal and they didn't tell everybody, but you can tell what was going on. And they had these puppies in a pen. And this puppy crawls up the fence as I'm sitting there at the mailbox and fell off the other side. And there's a big male pit bull there that killed him instantly, almost before he hit the ground. But if a baby falls off your neighbor's fence, what would you do? Would you act in that way? Why? What's the difference in you and the rest of the animal creation? There's a big difference. And we need to realize it. We need to understand it. We have a responsibility to God. We have a responsibility to be obedient to God. I think sometimes we do need to just stop and think. Just look, just with an open mind at the creation and see where we fit. Where we fit into that. Are we just an animal living here for a period of time and then we're going to be gone? If that's true, there's a lot of things about man we have a real hard time explaining. Real hard time explaining. So when you come back and you think of yourself as a spiritual creature, you have to then go back and remember that what that meant is that placed responsibility on you. See, your dog and cat doesn't have any responsibility. They don't have any. None. They're not responsible. I mean, you can do what you want, but the fact is they're just animals. That's what I sometimes say. I was just a dog. You may think it was one of your kids, but it's still just a dog. And everybody in any sense knows that. But when you stop and you think about a human being, we have responsibility. You think of the Ten Commandments, they weren't given to dogs and cats and bulls and pigs. They were given to people. And God says that we are to live by His word. Man shall not live by bread alone, Jesus said, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. When we violate that, we're responsible persons, and we know that, hey, we've committed sin. That places us at odds with God. It separates us from God. Isaiah said in Isaiah 55. We want to restore that relationship. How do we do it? By looking to God's word and seeing how. How does God say to do that? He said He sent His Son into the world that He would die so that men might be saved. John 3:16. God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son. Whosoever believes in Him shall not perish but have everlasting life. Then what do we do when we believe it? Be obedient to His word. I mean, you think about all the situations, and the one that comes to mind most is the Ethiopian eunuch. He's riding along in his chariot. He's reading from Isaiah 53. He doesn't understand what he's reading. Philip comes up, talks with him, explains it to him, tells him that that was really a picture of Jesus dying on the cross for the sins of mankind. Gets down the road a bit, said, see, here's water, what doth him to be baptized? Why did he say that? Because that's exactly what Philip told him. They stopped the chariot, he was baptized, and he went on his way rejoicing. Why? Because he restored the relationship with God he'd lost. There's a vast difference between human beings and animals. I think everybody knows that. Some people don't like to admit it, but there's a vast difference. What is the difference? Only one thing. We're created in the image of God. Therefore, we are obligated to be submissive to it. Think about that as together we stand.